Hello, I'm Matt Galloway, and this is the Current Podcast. War between the United States, Israel, and Iran continues to widen. Over the weekend, the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad was struck by rockets. All Americans in Iraq have been told to leave. And last night, U.S. President Donald Trump said that it would be very bad for the future of NATO if members failed to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. The CBC's chief correspondent, Adrienne Arsenault, is in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia this morning. Adrienne, hello.
Hey there, Matt.
It's good to talk to you, and it's good to talk to you from Saudi Arabia because you're there, but that wasn't the plan, right?
No, definitely wasn't the plan. And it's interesting, our visas were issued really quickly in one day on a Friday in Ramadan. I would have said that was impossible a few weeks ago. And I think what it tells us is that the Saudis are angry and they're confident that they're keeping this land safe. And they want both those things to be understood and seen. And it is interesting to look at the anger here because Saudi Arabia has said repeatedly to Iran, hey, we don't allow the United States to launch attacks against you from here. We've had this mediated relationship with you, with Beijing helping out. We thought we had an understanding. We haven't thrown out your ambassador. So what are you doing? Launching waves and waves of drones and missiles heading this way to Saudi Arabia. And those waves keep growing. And it's costing this country, not only in defense expenditures, but reputationally. Saudi Arabia, like a lot of Gulf states, sees itself as a stable place to work and do business. That is its future. Oil built it, but that's its future. And this war is totally chipping away at that.
Do you feel that instability there in Riyadh? Is there the sense that the country not is under attack, but in some ways is, facing attack?
So it's definitely under attack. Do you feel it? No. And I find this interesting. I wouldn't know where the shelters are here. I haven't heard a single alarm, and yet daily, I'm seeing notes from the Defense Ministry about 60 drones intercepted in the last few hours, 50 drones intercepted overnight. But you don't feel it. Other cities in the Gulf, like Kuwait, which are so close to Iran, have closed at night, effectively saying no parties, no weddings, no big gatherings. Here, nothing has changed. We notice a few things, like we're not allowed to take our cameras into the financial district. We know that's an area sort of targeted by Iran. But broadly, you feel nothing. And I think that is in part because the military might here is massive, but also it's a gift of geography. Riyadh is surrounded by hundreds of kilometers of desert. That is a big buffer.
As I mentioned in the introduction, Donald Trump, the U.S. president, last night, he has been calling on Iran to let ships through the Strait of Hormuz. And last night said that NATO members need to step up as well, that NATO would face, in his words, a very bad future if its allies don't back the United States. What do you make of that? And what do you make, being in the region, what do you make of this bottleneck in the Strait?
It's interesting. I remember Gulf War II, and we talked about coalition of the willing. This is starting to feel like coalition of the coerced. Trump demanding help from the NATO countries has gone further than help us open the Strait. He's also said, we need help, these are his words, knocking out bad actors on the shore. His argument is, you need the oil, so come help us, or NATO is in big trouble. He wants China's help as well. No country has said yes to this so far. And it's interesting that he looked at China because China doesn't have a problem getting oil through the Strait of Hormuz. India doesn't have a problem getting oil through the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has said, if countries, aligned with us, want to talk to us, we'll help them get their oil through. So it is interesting that this tiny patch of the earth is so difficult for the Americans with all their military might to keep open. The Gulf analysts say they were warning about this for a really long time, but they weren't heard. This country, Saudi, is in the process of moving its oil differently. It has this pipeline that goes from east to west, so it's taking the oil to it through another way, through the Red Sea and out. That will make a difference for the world eventually when that supply gets out there. But in the interim, this is not what Donald Trump referred to as sort of a small excursion or small endeavor. This is a big problem, and it so far is not getting any better.
It's not NATO that's just being threatened. Last week you had the Republican Senator Lindsey Graham warning, in his words, of consequences if Saudi Arabia doesn't join U.S. strikes against Iran. How is that being received, and what sort of position does that put Saudi Arabia in?
Well, the Saudis don't seem to be biting so far. Like, there's a saying here in Saudi Arabia that the living don't fight the dead. And it was sort of explained to me that you don't get into a fight with people who think they have nothing to lose and will fight to the death. It's just counterproductive. And that, in some ways, may be how Saudi Arabia sees this decision about whether to sort of get engaged directly in the war. It knows Iran's fighting this war of survival. And it's interesting, again, the Iranian ambassador is only a few kilometers away. He hasn't been asked to leave. So there's still this effort to try to walk the line delicately. But I do find that I was given a message by an analyst yesterday in the course of an interview. He said, if we ever were to get involved, we would trigger our bilateral relationship with Pakistan. Why is that interesting? Well, Pakistan is a nuclear nation. And so I said, well, are you saying that on purpose because of the nuclear? And he said, absolutely, it would be a nuclear umbrella. That is a very serious warning to Iran. But right now, Saudi wants no part of fighting this.
Just before I let you go, the sense from abroad is that it's unclear exactly what Donald Trump's endgame is as president when it comes to this war and how this war could end. And it feels to a lot of people like things aren't winding down at all. What is your feeling there? What are you reading there in terms of where this could go in the next few days and weeks?
It doesn't feel like it's ramping down. Again, this phrase, small endeavor, small excursion, we keep hearing this from the U.S. president. Surely doesn't feel like that on the ground here. I think who blinks, who talks are the things we have to watch for next. Will any of these countries heed Donald Trump's call for help in opening the strait? We're really talking about another Gulf War here. Will this coalition of the coerced, if you will, actually develop? And it's interesting. Every day that goes by, the U.S. president seems to get angrier about this and more aggrieved, saying here's more proof that NATO doesn't help. So how is that going to unfold? Does the U.S. hit the Iranian oil infrastructure? And if it does, what does Iran do? And if we're worried about oil, hold your horses, because if Iran hits water in a region like this, in a country like this that doesn't have a single river, you don't want to see what happens if water is threatened. So that's what makes everyone here very nervous.
Adrienne, good to speak with you as always. Thank you very much for this.
Take care, Matt.
Adrienne Arsenault is the CBC's chief correspondent. She is in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. As war in the Middle East continues, Prime Minister Mark Carney is once again on the road. He was in Norway over the weekend. Today, he met with the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer in London. Before this trip, there was China, India, Australia, Japan, and more. And all along, Mark Carney has emphasized the need to diversify trade, making deals on everything from uranium to electric vehicles to agricultural tariffs. But he's also talked more broadly about Canada's place in this world. Bessma Momani is a professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and a fellow at the NATO Defence College. And Roland Paris is director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, also a former foreign policy advisor to Justin Trudeau. Good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Morning.
Roland, let's talk about this warning from the U.S. president just briefly. He says that NATO faces, in his words, a very bad future if members don't step up to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. Australia has said no. Keir Starmer, the British Prime Minister, this morning said, we will not be drawn into a wider war with Iran. Where does that leave Canada?
Well, I think Canada, like all the other countries that you mentioned and other members of NATO, will be very reluctant to put itself in a position of having to salvage this situation for Donald Trump, an incredibly reckless war. And as Adrienne Arsenault pointed out, Donald Trump is not talking about some kind of merely defensive deployment. He's talking about having NATO forces in the region, striking bad actors on the shore. And so I think that this is going to be a real dilemma for members of NATO. Of course, NATO is very dependent on the United States for the security of Europe, and especially for its ongoing willingness to sell arms to Ukraine. And so this is a balancing act that NATO members are going to continue to pursue. But in the short run, I think that it would be an enormous mistake for Mark Carney to contemplate deploying Canadian troops into this war zone.
Bessma, Mark Carney has made a few different comments on this war, one in support of it, the other saying that it was support with regret and that he believed perhaps that the war did not align with international law. How clear is it at this point what Canada's position is on this war?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're just taking Carney's statements, that does seem as though there was a little bit of a flip-flop. I think that was mostly for domestic reasons, particularly seeing that a large number of the diaspora community of Iranians are in support of the initial attacks, although I think there's a lot of changing views there as we're seeing more and more of a humanitarian cost of this. But I think to the broader, point here is there's no strategy at all for this war. It is a war of choice. It does not meet the threshold of an imminent threat. So international law is clearly being overstepped here. And the shifting objectives alone is really problematic. And the very fact that the Americans have not factored in the closing of the straits just tells you how ill-planned this is. It is hubris at its best, and frankly, really reflects the Trump administration's overall incompetence on these matters.
Roland, presumably the Prime Minister will be asked about this. He is on another trip abroad in the UK, meeting with the Prime Minister and has an audience with the King as well. What do you make of the amount of time that he spent outside of the country in the past year, and what has that achieved?
Well, it's been an extraordinary amount of time outside of the country, but it's consistent with what he's said that he's trying to do. I mean, even from before he became Prime Minister, he's been talking about having to reorient Canada and our economy in order to strengthen our energy and industrial and defense capacity at home and to expand our economic partnerships outside of the United States, all with a mind to making us less dependent on the United States. We'll still be largely dependent on the United States, but less dependent and less exposed to kind of coercion and threats. And that was part of the theme of his speech in Davos. So if you take that as his starting point, then he has to spend time making deals abroad. And he has been, you mentioned a number of the countries, he's made new partnerships in Europe and in Asia with Japan, Korea, Australia, et cetera, and India. He will, at some point, I think, start running into questions about whether any additional trip is worth the time that he's spending outside of the country. And that will accentuate, I think, if and when Canadians have growing concerns about how he may be handling the domestic economy or other domestic issues. But for now, at least, I think Canadians have given him a fair amount of permission to pursue this agenda. And as long as he seems to be making progress in the goals of diversifying Canada's trade and economic relationships, I think he has a fair amount of latitude for this travel.
Bessma, do you want to pick up on that? The Prime Minister has talked about Canada's role as a middle power. Can he turn that into actual leverage on the world stage, do you think?
I mean, I think symbolically, I think the focus, no matter what, is definitely economic, as evidenced by where he's visiting. Really looking at countries that have economic opportunity, which, by the way, tend to be global South countries, and they're not necessarily economies that are thriving on the democracy scale either. I mean, that's the sort of hard part of this for all of us to fathom is just the reality that the growing global South don't tend to have thriving democracies. So this shift away, and I think this diversification strategy, let's say, shifting away from the U.S. is smart, but it's not necessarily with like-minded allies, and it's going to be a slow process. Diversification for businesses to switch clients and markets takes a long time. This is a perennial problem for Canada. It's not like the first time we've had this conversation of being overly dependent on the U.S., but I think now we really do have to put our money where our mouth is and go to these places, which, by the way, is not going to, materialize in a huge swing. I think if we're lucky to go from, let's say, 85% to the U.S. to 80%, that's progress. But it's really, really going to be a slow shift. Diversification is hard. And I think, Carney's approach is the right one, but it's going to take a long time to materialize.
Roland, what is Canada's place in the world under Mark Carney?
Well, part of the shock of this, of the last few years has really been shattering certain assumptions that we had about our place, in the sense that we were largely secure, surrounded by three oceans, and our neighbor to the south. The idea that although we've always had disputes with the United States over specific trade issues, the assumption that the United States would never use its disproportionate power to harm Canada, the assumption of Canadian sovereignty, the assumption of a world in which countries that Canada's allied to could at least manage the stability of large portions of it. All of those assumptions are out the window. And so quite naturally, a lot of the attention has focused for Canada on attending to our very immediate needs, security and economic security. And that has really kind of overshadowed questions about what Canada's larger role in the world is. Now, Carney hinted at some of this in his Davos speech when he talked about the role for middle powers working together. And he did so again, visiting the Nordic countries, where they reiterated that Canada and the Nordics will be part of a new middle power coalition. But it's really unclear what the middle power mobilization will look like when most of those middle powers are just as focused on scrambling to protect their own immediate interests as Canada has been.
Do we have a more coherent foreign policy now, do you think? I mean, part of the criticism of Canada under Justin Trudeau, there's the whole idea of Canada is back, but nobody actually knew what that meant, and nobody knew what it actually achieved. So, Roland, are things more coherent now?
I think they are more coherent because the urgency is just that much greater. You know, Canada, for a very long time, for decades after World War II, had a certain amount of luxury in its foreign policy to be able to focus on issues that you might say are not core security and international economic issues. Well, those days are over. And that kind of urgency does bring clarity. And I think that, to his credit, that Mark Carney has very much focused on those goals. Although, you know, as Bessma suggested, we're going to be dealing with some very complicated partners. And Mark Carney, in his initial reaction to the Iran invasion, showed that he himself has to work on that balance between the principles and the pragmatism that he's talked about.
Bessma, just final words to you. I mean, one of the things that people are going back to are the words that Mark Carney delivered at that Davos speech and elsewhere. We take the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. What does that mean in terms of where Canada sees itself in the world and where Canada is in this world?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, because I think a lot of folks have taken what they wanted out of the Davos speech. You know, some seeing it very much as a pragmatic view of the world, as you said, but also there was this tone of idealism almost there, you know, lamenting the death of the rules-based order. And I think a lot of countries, as we know, the speech was very popular. It got a lot of global attention, and partly because everybody got to take something out of it that they really needed to hear at a time when all we're hearing is just, you know, frankly, a lot of global misery. So I understand why people interpret different ways. But, you know, for Canada, I think we do have an opportunity here. It's not loud, unlike the previous government, which was a little more on the rhetoric, less on the action. I do think, as Roland noted, this is a more pragmatic approach that I think comes with more action and thankfully a little less rhetoric. And so I really appreciate the quiet diplomacy of you know, going around to different capitals and trying to just say we're here, we're ready to be a partner, a better trading partner. And I think in this world where, you know, relying on trading partners has become so fraught, Canada does have something positive to offer in that sense.
Quiet diplomacy in a very loud time, it feels like. We'll speak more about this, certainly, as those times unfold. In the meantime, thank you both for being here this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bessma Momani is a professor of political science at the University of Waterloo and a fellow at the NATO Defense College. Roland Paris is director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. You've been listening to The Current Podcast. My name is Matt Galloway. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you soon.